And welcome back. We are moving into our first conversation for today.
Yes, and we have on set with us Tamisang David Phirie. Yeah, and he is a senior anti-corruption officer with the DCEC, the Directorate on Corruption and Economic Crime.
Yes, indeed.
So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And he's all the way from Botswana.
That's right.
Yeah.
Here with the specific objective to share the lessons learned in your particular journey, your country's particular journey,
Indeed.
in rolling out the UNCAC. So I want to start off just by finding out a bit more about you and how long you have been working specifically in anti-corruption.
Okay. I've been with the DCEC, acronym from our organization, for roughly 4 years now. So I've been with the legal department since 2012. But in between that, I also was a prosecutor for the Director of Public Prosecutions, also dealing with issues of anti-corruption, prosecution of anti-corruption and asset recovery and such and such. So that's where my main area of expertise lie. We've also been involved in terms of reviewing other countries in terms of the implementation of the UNCAC. In this case, Swaziland, which did very well. We are also in the process of reviewing Djibouti, another African country. So that's been where we've been for the past couple of years.
So that's an interesting perspective. Having worked in the DPP's office, you were able to identify where the gaps were in your cases, in being able to prosecute crimes that are deemed corrupt. Now, tell me a bit about what deficiencies you saw from that end.
I think it was in terms of our investigations. What we've tried to do since then is try to do what we call a prosecution-led investigation model. What we try to do is have a prosecutor be involved in the investigation process from start to finish. At every step of the investigation process, the prosecutor or attorney or whoever it may be who has a legal background on what is going on is there at every step of the way to make sure that at the end of the day, the byproduct of the investigations is able to sustain itself in court, and therefore a conviction is able to be sustained.
What was the conviction rate before?
I can't tell. I can't say the conviction rate at the moment, but it was quite low, because before then we didn't have an anti-corruption prosecution unit. It's only been roughly 3 years, if I'm not mistaken, that it's been in operation. So since then, things have moved a lot better. There's a lot less backlog, and we also have what we call a special corruption court, which has a specific judge who is attached to the court to be able to deal specifically with corruption-related issues. So all of our cases are faced with a focus on that.
Now, explain to me a bit about the different lenses that the investigators would have versus a prosecutor, because crimes of this sort are typically covert. I mean, you don't always have a peer trail that you can follow, and many of it happens where many people are completely unaware of, and oftentimes unless there's a whistleblower involved.
Indeed. A lot of the times our cases emanate from when there's a source or complainant who has some sort of grievance with whatever has happened. So most of the time investigators have that information through what we call informants. They recruit informants and they tell us, no, this is what goes on. In terms of the prosecutor is able to understand what the investigator needs to bring into the picture, so that in terms of the elements of the offense, they're able to pick and choose what is the evidence that they need for each element of the offense. So it's a group effort, really, more so to speak. Yeah.
Now, you said you transitioned from the DPP's office into the DCEC, and you've been very involved, of course, in terms of the implementation of the UNCAC. Here in Belize, we celebrated our 1-year anniversary, which is why you're here as the keynote speaker. And there are many lingering questions. I think one of the common misconceptions people had was signing on to the UNCAC, you would begin to see immediate effects of what the convention itself lays out. Tell us a bit about the Botswana experience.
Well, first I'd like to say, when you sign the UNCAC, it doesn't automatically mean things will change. A lot of things come into play, because resources as well are needed. We need to change the legal framework. We need to change a lot of things. Perceptions of people also need to be done, to be taken into account. You need the political will to be able to change certain things in place. I'm aware that yours took a while to be signed, so it's a long process. In terms of our country, we're already ahead in terms of implementing certain aspects of the UNCAC before it came into play. We already had our graph busting agency, the DCEC, was already in place, and we already were in the process of getting setting up institutions such as the FIA. You have the Financial Intelligence Unit. We have the Financial Intelligence Agency.
Okay.
We had the Botswana Unified Revenue Services, all of which were oversight authorities which were intended to grapple with corruption at that point in time. We also have what we call the Director of Intelligence and Security Services, which assists on issues on a national security level, so that all of these organizations came together and then assisted in the fight against corruption. There's other aspects of the UNCAC that need to be highlighted in terms of what we call asset recovery. Asset recovery in this instance is when a person has illicitly enriched themselves, either a public official or some other individual. And therefore, the UNCAC requires that in terms of certain articles, you are able to trace those properties, take them back and give them back to the people or to the state, and then further improve the infrastructure of the country. So we have now what we call an asset forfeiture unit, which is focused on doing that. So that's what we're trying to do in terms of trying to implement the UNCAC. We're obviously still we're not perfect. We're far from perfect. Even though we're rated at number 35 in the world and number 1 in Africa, but still, we still have a long way to go, because even after our review, the first cycle review, we were lacking in certain aspects, and we are trying to change the laws into coming into force.
It was a major turnaround in Botswana.
Yeah.
And I want you to tell me from your perspective, what were the catalysts, or what was the tipping point? Because we hear about transparency, accountability, anti-corruption. These are politician words, and they don't always translate to people because we don't see it being taken seriously. What do you consider to be the real tipping point in Botswana that moved you in the right direction?
I think we've always had a strong media. We always had a strong civil society, and the political level has always been there. Although there are times when the political world just shuns away from doing certain things, but all these things, the media, civil society, and certain players in the business sector have always been major players in moving the country forward. Corruption affects everybody, so they were very vocal, especially our media. Our media is ruthless. I'm sure you can relate. So yes, all those people came into play, and things gradually changed. So that's how we really tried to move forward in terms of anti-corruption in our country.
And as Marlene mentioned, when we signed on to UNCAC, most of us were expecting immediate results. And there is now a little skepticism that we aren't seeing the results, which has largely to do with us not really understanding what it meant. But I'd like for you to you mentioned briefly just now some of the steps that you took towards becoming I consider a success story. So could you maybe explain a little bit more what the steps were in getting there?
I think the first thing that we needed mostly in terms of setting up legal institutions and changing the laws was resources. Okay. What we tried to do mostly was to change the laws to bring them to par with the UNCAC, so that we can be able to say, no, certain articles we've achieved. And what we tried to do was also train people. It's important to have people who understand what anti-corruption, money laundering, asset recovery are. You need to train not just lawyers, you need to train prosecutors, you need to train magistrates, you need to train just about everybody. Even the civil society you need to engage. What we also tried to do was inculcate a culture of anti-corruption in the community, starting at grassroots levels, schools, communities, and everyone else, so that it's not just an issue of saying the DCEC is the only one concerned with anti-corruption issues, but everyone in the community has a responsibility to fight corruption. So it was a myriad of issues that we did. It wasn't a step-by-step thing. Okay. It was always, because in terms of our organization, we have a 3-pronged strategy. We have investigations, we have public education, we have corruption prevention. So all these aspects come together, and then we have all these little things that we do all at one time, because the DCEC is mandated with the anti-corruption issue. So that's kind of what we try to do in terms of taking steps to fulfill certain aspects of the UNCAC.
Let's talk about your work in public education, because I think it's an element that we've heard the project board and the Attorney General speak of the importance. We're not quite sure yet whether or not it resonates with people. As we pointed out, people just expected things to start to change. Yeah. Why is it that the everyday citizen needs to understand what corruption is and the different types of corruption that may be taking place in the country?
I think it's important because it affects them generally. Because you need to understand when someone pilfers the public coffers, it will affect you at the end of the day. You will not have infrastructure, you will not have clean water, you will not have roads, you will not have things that an ordinary person would need. We call them, what are these, socio-economic rights. So in terms of informing people, they need to understand that in terms of knowing what anti-corruption is, knowing what corruption is, they can be able to then bring it to the fore, speak out loud, tell us as the DCEC, because in terms of where we are, we have what we call community-based anti-corruption clubs, where then at the bottom, people understand what is going on in terms of anti-corruption. Therefore, they tell, it's more like sharing the responsibility, really. So when you inform people, when you tell them exactly what's going on in terms of anti-corruption, and when something happens, then they're able to understand, they're able to report it, and then therefore it kind of assists us in terms of our fight against corruption.
Now, in addition to the public education, you spoke of the legislative changes, which are very important.
Indeed.
What is the process like of drafting the legislation, especially ensuring that there aren't any loopholes that can be used to override whatever processes have been put in place to prevent corruption?
Okay, in terms of when laws come into place in our country, there's what we call a cab memo. A cab memo is like a draft of the bill, and it's sent to different ministries, different departments, different offices. Then there are certain officers who are said, give input on what should be included or what should not be included. So it's a lot of stakeholders come into play. It's not just one person who suggests that a particular law come into play, but a lot of stakeholders, even the civil society and business sectors are involved to say, this is a law that needs to be put in place, this is our expectation. Even the constituents, because members of parliament also often speak to their constituents and say, we want to do this, do you think it's a really good idea? They say, yes, but it would be ideal if you do it in this particular manner. So that's, in terms of what we do, we try to involve all the stakeholders, such that when it comes to parliament, and as much as there may be a lot of dilution when it gets there, but we hope that at the time in parliament when it's being addressed and debated, they do not dilute it to a point where it just becomes nothing.
What was the biggest or most influential legislative change that you think came as a result of UNCAC in Botswana?
We had three.
Okay.
Our Corruption and Economic Crime Act. It changed the landscape in terms of adding additional offenses, abuse of office, defining conflict of interest, and expanding the definition of what is called a public body. It also tried to give our Director General a little bit of independence from the executive, such that whatever decision he makes or she makes is not dependent upon the executive, the judiciary, or the legislature. We also had what we call the Whistleblowing Act, which protects people who are going to report anything that they feel needs to be reported that affects issues of corruption. We had what we call the Proceeds and Instruments of Crime Act. That is the most important one in my opinion, because it goes back to asset recovery. It deals with ill-gotten gains, which we could then recover from the people who had actually taken them away from the people. So those are the three main changes since the UNCAC that have come into play.
And the DCEC, it's an autonomous body. Could you speak to us a little bit about how it was formed?
Okay. It was formed in 1994. Prior to 1994, there was a lot of issues around land scandals going on in the country. So that the commission was set up. The commission, after being set up, indicated that there's a need for an organization in your country that will deal with corruption. So in 1994, Parliament relented, and an act of Parliament was passed such that the DCEC was formed. So it happened around 1994, and we currently have 3 branches across the country. So that's how it is at this present moment.
And how do you ensure autonomy?
Pardon?
How do you ensure autonomy?
It's a difficult one because our organization, the Director General is appointed by the President. That is the biggest problem that we have. But even in terms of the decisions that he makes, he's not entitled to consult anyone in terms of who investigates and who, and such and such. So we're trying to balance it in that way, but it would be ideal in terms of autonomy and independence for the Director General to be appointed not by the President, but probably by the legislature or Parliament in terms of a committee or something. But that is where we are, and that is where hopefully the UNCAC will force our government to move to in terms of the appointment of the Director General.
Now, you were here to give a presentation as the keynote speaker on Monday in regards to your experience. What were the particular lessons that you wanted to bring to a country like Belize that is so early in its rolling out of the UNCAC?
Okay. I think it's important to, first of all, educate the people. Our most important thing in terms of our anti-corruption initiatives in our country is that you need to educate the people. Know what is going on the ground, in Parliament, everywhere else. They need to understand that corruption is an issue that affects everybody else. And in terms of also who to involve the civil society. Civil society is very strong in terms of building that momentum to push certain people to act. Involve the media, you guys. you have a strong voice. I don't know what your viewer base is, but I want to believe that people listen to you. They call in, they say what is on their mind. So you have big influences. Make sure that you tell the people exactly what needs to be known. Do not be afraid. Without fear or favor, say the truth. So I would say that in addition, there should be some legal reforms. I mean, I know you don't have an anti-corruption agency, but you have a financial intelligence unit. But that is not enough. There's a need for an anti-corruption agency. It may take resources, but in terms of cost-benefit analysis, in the long run, it will benefit you at the end of the day. Yeah.
Now, I hear, and it seems to be a common theme in talking about the public education portion. And I think if I were to speak of the landscape in Belize, people understand that there's corruption taking place. What seems to be missing oftentimes is the connection between what that corruption means for the quality of life and also the role that they play in being able to change that in any way, shape, or form. What would be your advice in terms of how to build that connection?
That is it's a difficult one.
Well, because without it, people become complacent about the issue. It's corruption will always take place. People in authority will always do what they want.
Yeah. For example, in some places, corruption is a culture. It's endemic. People do it. They say, if I don't do it, I don't get my license. If I don't do it, I don't get property. If I don't do it, I don't get it's a culture. So it needs to be inculcated into the people to say that you need to know how this affects not just you, but future generations to come. Because if they do not understand how it's going to affect them, their children, and more generations to come, then it is not going to help them. It's important that everyone understand that corruption is an issue that is, it's a worldwide problem.
Yeah.
It accounts for 5% of GDP globally. I can imagine how much that is for Belize.
And challenges that you faced in Botswana?
I think for us, it has always been political will, here and there. Political will is there are times when it's there and there are times when it's not there. Without the necessary political will, certain things cannot be done. We have two important acts that have not been put in place. We have the Declaration of Assets Act, which is not there, and we don't have an Access to Information Act, which you have. I want to believe that you also have a Declaration of Assets, if I'm not mistaken, but I don't know how much it's being implemented.
Only just started and 1 year back.
You see now. So those are the challenges that we are currently having. And also another issue that we noted earlier is that the independence of our organization is still not solidified in terms of the Constitution. So there's a need for a constitutional constitutional backing of our organization, because we're trying to move away from the mainstream public service, but still there's a need to constitutionally guarantee the independence of the DCEC. So those are areas that we're struggling in. In terms of other aspects, we also have resources in terms of personnel and money. People are lacking in terms of anti-corruption. There's no real anti-corruption practitioners in our country. Even in terms of judges and magistrates, you need to be able to train them. So there's a lack of that resource in terms of personnel to be able to say. Because in our country, we have roughly 2.5 million people, and our organization has only 300 people. So you can imagine that and of those 300, only 180 are really into anti-corruption prevention, public education. The rest is corporate services staff. So there's a need to be able to improve or increase the capacity and capacitate more people in terms of anti-corruption, not just within the DCEC, but also the Directorate of Public Prosecutions, the police, and other oversight authorities.
Earlier you mentioned a club I can't remember.
Committee.
We have anti-corruption clubs.
Clubs.
Yes.
What I mean when I think club, I think like maybe like a youth group or something. So when you say anti-corruption club, what is it exactly that you're speaking?
It's
to?
exactly what you're saying.
Okay.
It's a youth club. We
Okay.
have them in schools. We have them in organizations, and we have them in terms of villages. We have what we call community-based anti-corruption clubs. So these are people who, on a regular basis, we train so that they understand what corruption is, and then they become like representatives in the village to say, okay, fine. If I need to register an issue about corruption, I go to that person. He will relate my message to the DCEC. In terms of school anti-corruption clubs, we're trying to say inculcate that knowledge of anti-corruption, not just into public service, but involve it into the students as well. There's an incentive strategy we're trying to do where we're trying to have public education in terms of anti-corruption inculcated into the syllabus, into the
the school curriculum,
into the school curriculum. So that's what we're trying to do in terms of. So that's where anti-corruption clubs come. That they happen in school, in the community, and also in other organizations.
It's also expanding your human resource in terms of people who are more knowledgeable about anti-corruption. Now, there's an interesting portion that you mentioned, and I think we recognize it here in this country with human resources. For example, if we have procurement practices that are well outlined, but an understaffed and not autonomous system put in place, if you look at the books, it looks like we are well ahead of time. But in practice, it cannot be implemented as thoroughly as one would hope.
Indeed.
What's your experience in Botswana in being able to overcome that particular challenge?
It's still a challenge.
Yeah.
It's still a challenge because at times you may have certain procedures and systems in place, but if you do not have the right personnel or the right number of personnel, it won't work. It still becomes an issue. So we're still also grappling with that, but we're trying to plug the gaps as much as we can.
And looking at the issue of asset recovery, have you been able to recover assets as yet? And
what we've done currently is freeze a couple of accounts.
Okay.
Just recently when I came, there was a case that just, if you were to go through the media, there was a case of money laundering of around 250 million pula was transferred between certain accounts. So what we have not had many cases in terms of success of asset recovery. We had one recently where we recovered 1.2 million pula over property which was acquired over a certain period of time. He was paying certain ghost employees, and at the end of the day, the money came to him. So we have an order in that case, which we recovered 1.2 million. So
it was a person in public office?
Yeah,
or?
it was a person in public office. He was a payroll officer, so he would pay ghost employees, and the accounts would eventually pay him at the end of the day. He amassed quite a fortune. So we managed to get an order to say, no, you've amassed 1 point something million, bring it back. We will sell your property, we'll sell your cars, we'll sell your houses, but somehow you're going to have to pay us back. So we have that. The cases are few and far between. Like I said, we only just started in terms of having an asset forfeiture unit. So we will baby steps really.
And what is the process like in terms of being able to trace where the assets are? And I mean, obviously you can't disclose all your inner workings, but it is challenging. I mean, you don't always have the trail to find the money or the assets that have been acquired with that money.
Yeah. There are certain investigative tools that we could use. It would take us all day to actually just discuss them.
We wouldn't understand.
Yeah, but there are certain investigative tools that we try to use to be able to trace what we have. But a lot of the times we're usually helped by people. The people help us. People come forward and say, this person bought this certain property from me. As far as I know, he earns this much money. Where does he get this? So it has a lot to do with the people helping us more than it's us using other investigative tools.
And so that's where the Whistleblower Act becomes important.
Yes.
And what does that provide for people who disclose information?
Initially,
even potentially implicating themselves.
Yeah, initially we had thought that it would have what we call the witness protection program. We all know the US has that witness protection program where they move you from one part of the country to another.
Yeah.
I always wanted to be one of those people. But what it kind of tries to do is to say whoever reports an issue, adverse to the public interest, we will do our best to make sure that that person's name and identity is not known. So, in as much as we all, even in the DCEC Act, there's also a provision to that effect. But this one kind of bolstered it and gave the people confidence to say, we actually have a law that actually specifically deals with your issues. It deals with how a certain person is to be protected in terms of after they've disclosed certain issues, and what issues are going to come into play, how you're going to deal with someone who intimidates, if at all, what a person discloses the identity of the person who reported. So it's a little compact. It is not as comprehensive as some of us would have liked it to be, but we'll take it.
So you didn't actually use a witness protection program?
No, we don't have a witness protection program.
So but it does include immunity as well?
Yes, it does include immunity.
Okay.
Yeah.
And charges for any person who tries to intimidate or
Yes.
hinder the process of
Indeed.
what the whistleblower is doing.
Yes.
I think the thing that would concern, at least it popped in my head, in Belize is very small. And
Yeah.
we all know each other.
Yeah, hey?
You know, close to 400,000 now, but that's still pretty small.
Yeah.
We all know each other. So I'm not sure, and maybe you could tell us how that would work here. I don't really.
I think it's an issue of anonymity. I think what it gives you is, how can I say, a cloak to say, okay, fine, I hide my identity, then I can say whatever needs to be said so that the relevant authorities need to act. That's all they can do for now. I think in terms of trying to have a witness protection program, it would be very difficult in a country where there's only 400,000 of you. Because you'd be like, no, I've changed my name from Alexander to David, and I live in Belmopan now.
Yeah.
And it will be easy to find you,
Yeah.
you know? Yeah, so that's what it is.
And just building that confidence, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there repercussions for persons if they disclose who the source
Indeed,
is?
yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
It's an offense punishable by jail time.
Okay.
Yes.
So if you go
Or a
to
fine.
a police officer, for example, that police officer is also bound to confidentiality.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So what do you consider to be the important first steps? At this point, we've sent out our self-assessment. We're awaiting our review. You've had the experience of going out to review other African countries. What can we expect in that process?
In terms of what to do.
When the countries, I think we have Haiti and
Tuvalu
coming in to do their independent review.
Expect a thorough assessment of your country. They are going to be hopefully not so brutal, but what they will try to do at the end of the day is help you to plug the gaps. What we've tried to do after the review, we'll also do a benchmarking exercise in certain countries to see what they do, best practices. So you can expect that they will go to certain oversight authorities. I don't know how many you have. I know the FIU. I don't know if you have any more.
Integrity Commission, Public Accounts
And
Committee.
then the Integrity Commission, yes.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of oversight authorities that they're going to go to and then assess their competence, the legal framework that they work under, as well as they're going to try and assess the laws that are in place in terms of fighting corruption, asset recovery, and money laundering. So they're going to try and really see where you fit and how you can improve going further. Yeah. And maybe then you'll see change. Then you'll probably see change. You'll probably see change in terms of having an anti-corruption agent, because there is a need, in terms of the UNCAC, there's a need to have an anti-corruption agency. There's a need to have an FIU. There's a need to deal with asset recovery. So you'll probably see those issues come into play if the people who are tasked to do that, to deal with those recommendations, actually act on them.
Yeah. And that's where all the different elements come in, the political will,
Yes.
the public education, and a robust civil society.
Yes, but that, of course, you need to understand that signing into the UNCAC brought itself some obligations. So once those recommendations are put in place, there's an obligation of some sort to say, we need to act on these. We need to be able to be in line with that. We signed to say we will implement. So now it's time to modify our laws or legal framework or institutions to be in line with the UNCAC.
Now let's talk money. Where were you able to source the word? That's what he says. Oh, I hope I'm all the time.
Okay.
No, but it's an expensive endeavor to
It
be
is.
able to roll out the implementation and the training, the establishment of particular offices and bodies. Where were you able to source your funds from?
Our country is rich in diamonds.
We know.
That is our
Nobody
main-
knew they knew after the royal engagement, right? Yeah.
So a lot of we tried to really use the resources that we have
Okay.
to gain the necessary financial needs to be able to set up these institutions. So the backbone of our economy is diamonds, agriculture, tourism, and beef. So a lot of those areas have been, and then there's been the recent, I don't know if I should say this, no, this one I cannot mention.
Oh, man.
But yeah, so on the backbone of these, our country has been able to try and use the monies
So
gained
you've
from
been
that.
more self-funded. That's what I'm trying to understand.
Not necessarily. Every country has some financial aid. The IMF helps, the World Bank
Yeah.
helps. So those are the areas. Those are the countries. We have also assistance of the UNODC in terms of technical expertise. The UNDP, those help us in terms of technical expertise and training. So
Okay.
we're very thankful to them. If without them, a lot of us would not be where we are right now. I wouldn't be here if it were not for the UNODC and the UNDP. So
Okay.
thank you to them.
And we are wrapping up the segment now, so I won't ask you any more about money or what you were about to say but didn't say. But I'd like for you, I mean, you came in as a keynote speaker, speaking to different stakeholders, kind of encouraging the process. Now speak to the public, those who are still cynical about whether or not this will affect any meaningful change in the country or if it'll just be lip service. About what the importance is of having signed the document and moving the process along at this point.
I would say take Botswana as an example. Learn from us in terms of where we've been and where we're going. The UNCAC is an important tool. It obligates your country to be able to. It obligates your country to do things that needs to be done to be able to be in line with the UNCAC. To be able to say certain aspects of well, not certain aspects really, all aspects of anti-corruption need to be dealt with. So I would suggest that everyone take it upon themselves to understand what the UNCAC is about, to understand what anti-corruption is about, and to really have a sense of responsibility. The theme for this year, I think it was United Against Corruption. So do that, unite as a nation, as 400,000 of you, unite and
Close
fight
to
the scourge that is
400,000.
corruption.
All right, well, thank you for coming in and sharing your experience. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right. We're going to go ahead now and take a break. And when we come back, we'll be joined by representatives of the Rotary Club of Belize. So stay tuned.